Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us for this virtual joint meeting of the ITTEA and EAAFP on illegal taking of birds. I'm Susan Tsang. I'm the coordinator of the ITTEA, and Mark Carey is here representing the EAAFP. I think that this will be a good talk to have just because we've had a bit of a stretch where we've been working on other things and giving people updates on what's going to be upcoming in the upcoming year, and also just having finally a chance to hear from Ed after trying to get this seminar going for quite some time now. I quickly will ask Mark, do you have any updates that you would like to say for the EAAFP that anybody should know about?
Thanks, Susan, and hi, everyone. From the partnership perspective, I don't think there's a lot to update this group on other than we're getting close to the end of our intersessional period. Hopefully there'll be a formal announcement of MOP 12 in the next month or two. The government of the Philippines have kindly agreed to host MOP 12 in November next year, so we're sort of really looking forward to MOP 12, and hopefully we can have a face-to-face meeting at that forum next year. That would be really good. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it from Flyway partnership perspective.
Okay. And I have to admit one more person coming in. Okay. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. So Dr. Eduardo Gallo-Cajiao, who is at Colorado State University, is in the Department of Human Dimensions and Natural Resources, and he recently completed his postdoc at the University of Washington. He might be a familiar face to some of you since he did his PhD in Australia, might have crossed paths with him at some point. And his work aims to understand how governance dimensions impacts migratory species conservation at various scales. So today he will actually talk us through his findings of a recent study that he did. And I already have also linked the paper online on the ITTEA website if you are curious. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can get to the talk. And you should be able to see it. Okay, and Ed, you can just tell me when you want to advance the next slide.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me properly? Yep.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so yeah, so it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, Susan, for the invite and for the patience. So yeah, so basically, I would just like to, I thought it will be very timely to be able to share this research, which was finally published, was actually part of my PhD, which looked at the global or international environmental governance dimensions of migratory shorebird conservation in the East Asian Australasian flyway. And this was a particular study looking at the governance structures of those of that governance of those institutional arrangements across the region, specifically for habitat conservation, which I refer to as habitat designation, and hunting management. So we can move to the next slide, please. So for that, let's start off then where we actually situate this study conceptually. And we need to really look at it from a social ecological fit perspective. Social ecological fit, basically understood, that just sounds like a little bit of a mouthful, but really is nothing else than just the degree to which institutional arrangements or governance structures capture spatially, primarily spatially, the ecological dimensions of the problems we are trying to solve. So this is actually this particular drawing. I really like this diagram, and this is taken from a paper published a few years ago by Eric Tremel and others, looking at the social ecological fit of various issues in the Coral Triangle region. And this is just basically looking at, it really shows very nicely the various layers at which we consider that match, and is the degree to which that governance geography of the jurisdictions are actually, we need to really look at those, how they relate to ecological connectivity, and we could start thinking about parallels with what's going on with shorebirds in the East Asian Australasian flyway. And then lastly, to what degree those actual institutional linkages given by agreements signed between countries are actually capturing that ecological connectivity. So basically, that was the very foundational concept, I guess, on which I based this particular study. So we can move to the next one, please. So for this, we'll need to probably take a step back, and something that we did a little bit earlier than this particular paper, and I think that was very foundational, was the understanding of hunting in this particular flyway. And just something that is very interesting is to think about how hunting had been reported for a long time in the flyway, and we got much further along in the understanding of habitat loss, particularly in the Yellow Sea, by the work of Nick Murray from the University of Queensland too, and others. But then we really lagged behind in terms of our understanding of hunting. And basically what we did in this particular study was to synthesize and put together all the various pieces of information that were available on hunting. So basically the problem that we thought it was, I mean, in the case of hunting, was a big problem of aggregation, basically. We were not aggregating data at the right spatial scale. And that precluded us or prevented us from actually understanding the severity of the issue. We can move to the next one, please. And this was the bottom line of what we found, basically, is all those black dots on the map, really, all what they are showing is just records of hunting across the region in different time slices. But long story short, this map really shows that hunting is pervasive or has been pervasive throughout the region. And that this has indeed the potential to explain some of the population declines. We can move to the next one, please. So then this takes us to this particular question then, which is, what is the social ecological fit? Now that we understand what a social ecological fit is, what is the social ecological fit of the governance frameworks in relation to habitat conservation and hunting management in the East Asian Australasian flyway? And it was work that I did with my main two supervisors, Professor Tiffany Morrison and Professor Rich Fuller. So we can go to the next one, please. So there was an earlier study, which was the very first step. And well, if we want to do that assessment of how those governance structures are matching the ecological dimensions of migratory shorebirds, especially, then I guess the very first step was to understand what is the actual overarching framework of institutional arrangements in the region. And basically, this is just to say how many agreements in one way or another, and what are the actors that are members to those agreements. And what we found was that we have 28 agreements with 56 members connected to those particular agreements. So at the higher, the top part of the slide, this particular network graph, what we have is all the institutional arrangements, and the arrows on the lines are indicating membership, and all the nodes or squares or diamonds at the bottom are representing various types of members to those agreements. Go to the next one, please. So here the very first question then, in terms of the actual matter for this particular study. And the very first one is, well, what are the specific governance architectures for habitat designation and hunting management? I just kind of use architecture and framework interchangeably in this particular case. And how can we understand them in terms of actors and institutional arrangement, like the actual agreements that have been signed to by any given actor within the region. Can go to the next one, please. So, and here we are. So basically, these two graphs are representing, these two networks are representing subsets of agreements taken from that initial graph, network graph that I just shared with you. So the bottom represents the hunting framework or architecture for hunting management, and the upper one represents those agreements for habitat designation. So basically 19 agreements at the top that are agreements that have specific prescriptions for the designation of habitat under different degrees of formality, different degrees of how strict they are in terms of allowing for other land uses. but generally speaking, they have very specific provisions for the designation of areas for conserving migratory shorebirds in one way or another. Some of them are more specific than others, but nevertheless, they all have those prescriptions. And the bottom one, 16 agreements that have specific prescriptions, again, for hunting management that involves in one way or another, with various degrees of specificity, migratory shorebirds. We can go to the next one, please. So now let's start looking at the actual question of social ecological fit, which we can understand from this particular study as on three. We looked at it basically in three levels. So the first one is talking about coordinating capacities, and we use a metric on network theory that is called betweenness centrality, and we can go to the next one, please. And basically, betweenness centrality, we look at the graph, the network on the right. Basically, we see a node represented in red color, and what that's showing us is just a very high betweenness centrality, and that's just in contrast with the network on the left, which we see then that node represented in green that has very high degree centrality, which is basically the number of other nodes that are directly connected to that particular node. And that would be just a very simple measure of degree centrality. In the case of betweenness centrality is how much of the entire network is held together by a particular node. And that's what we are measuring in this particular case, is the relative betweenness centrality of all the various agreements in the East Asian Exploration Flyway. So now let's think for a second, then let's remember that those two graphs, the one for habitat and the one for hunting. And now let's move on to the next slide, please. And basically what we have here is the actual measure of betweenness centrality for each of those nodes, which are basically all those dots that are representing international agreements. So those two columns are, well, the one on the very center, really, the one in the middle is habitat. And those are all the values for habitat related agreements. And the ones for on the left, on the right, represent all those values of betweenness centrality for those agreements that have provisions for hunting. And what we see in the case of habitat is that, as you guessed it, the agreement with the highest betweenness centrality is the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership. So basically, what that's telling us is that in the case of the habitat governance framework, the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership is the most central of all agreements and is the one that holds most importantly or plays a more central role within the entire context of that particular network. So that's the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership. And according to network theory, nodes in this particular case, international agreements that or agreements that have high betweenness centrality are considered to have high brokerage capacities, basically. That's in a stark contrast with the case of hunting. In the case of hunting values or those agreements that have relevance to hunting, we see that the one that has the highest value is the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that already starts having some issues when we think about that the Convention on Biological Diversity is a very generic agreement. So issue scope is what is on that represented in those letters S and G. S for specialized agreements and G for very generic agreements. So in the case of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the value is probably half of that of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership. And we need to note very importantly that the CBD is a very generic agreement. So very unlikely to be able to really play an important role in how we manage and how we think about hunting in the East Asian Australasian Flyway for shorebirds. Let's move on to the next one, please. So now let's move on to the second measure or the second way in which we consider that question of the degree to which those agreements are actually matching the ecological dimensions of migratory shorebirds. Sorry, we go to the next one. Yeah, that one. Yeah, thank you. So basically what we did for this particular question, just to show you as an example what we have on that table on the upper left is a sample of different species of migratory shorebirds, and what we have is the number of agreements that have been signed by any given country across the entire migratory range or range for each species. And what we did there was just to calculate the average, basically, the mean value for each species for those agreements, first, that are concerned with habitat, and secondly, those agreements that are concerned for hunting. And then what we found basically is that on average, countries through which migration happens for most species tends to be higher in the case of habitat compared to hunting. Basically, when we think about migratory shorebird, they are migrating through countries that have signed more agreements concerned with habitat than agreements that are concerned with hunting. And we could think about this. The way I like to think about this is in terms of resilience. When we think about that countries sometimes could pull out of agreements, or that some agreements may become inactive sometimes. And when we think about that, then basically it would take much more agreements to fall apart in the case of habitat than in the case of hunting. So basically in hunting, we have a much, what do you call it, weaker, but a little bit more vulnerable system when it comes to potential politics at play. And let's go on to the next one, please. And then the very last measure is, and I guess this is the one where we really were able to measure that ecological dimension of migratory shorebirds in a very spatially explicit way, and is the degree to which the migratory network for select taxa, in this particular case, 10 subspecies, actually is covered by the network of international agreements signed by all the 22 countries. And that's, of course, if we are excluding Taiwan. And we can go on to the next one, please. So basically, we took this from another study conducted by Tak Iwamura. And in that particular paper, they were looking at a different issue. And this particular issue didn't have a political dimension. It was only ecological. They were looking at sea level rise impact, but nevertheless, they did half of the job for us, which was they built a network of how the birds were moving across the region between different nodes. And what we did was basically to build the network, both including northward and southward migration for 10 taxa, for 10 subspecies of shorebirds. And what we did afterwards was to overlay the network of agreements that we have derived from the data we collected. And we can go on to the next slide, please. And this is what we have. So the one on the left represents habitat, the ones on the right represent hunting. And basically, the reason why the structure of the networks is identical is because the very base layer on both networks is given by the combined northward and southward migration for 10 migratory shorebird taxa in the East Asian Australasian flyway. What is different across these two networks, habitat and hunting, is the thickness of the line. And the thickness of the lines connecting those dots representing individual countries, basically that thickness is representing the number of agreements. And the color representing absence or presence of agreements. So black represents presence of any given agreement, so at least one or more. In the case of red lines, that representing absence of agreement. So basically, red lines means that there is connectivity given by movement of birds, but that those movements are not being covered by any agreement. So of course, Taiwan is an isolate from that perspective. But interestingly, for instance, in the case of hunting, we know that in Alaska, there is hunting, there is subsistence hunting. We know that in New Zealand, there has been some reports, at least in the past, of hunting that has been illegal. Yet, as an example, the US and New Zealand do not have an agreement that involves hunting at its core, just as an example. And what we see at the bottom, those bar graphs, what they are showing basically is the H degree distribution, and the H degree distribution basically is the thickness of the line. So basically all those numbers that we see on the x-axis, what we're representing is how many agreements are represented by any given thickness of those lines. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So basically, in the case of habitat, for instance, that means that we have over 25 ties or over 25 connections between countries that have 3 agreements, as an example. Whereas in the case of hunting, what we have is that all the connections have 2 or fewer agreements. So basically, what we see in this particular case is that habitat has a stronger connections across the region compared to hunting, and that's in line and reinforces what we found in the previous question. But more importantly, this is combined with the idea of how central any given agreement is within the network. And when we think about habitat, habitat has at its core and at its center the East Asian Strategic Flyway Partnership. And the EAAFP is really a habitat-focused agreement, but there is no equivalent to the EAAFP when we consider hunting. And that's basically just highlighting a very important gap in the governance system. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So the take-home messages. So this really just comes down to 2 main take-home messages. Habitat conservation is better addressed than hunting management within the governance structures for migratory shorebird conservation internationally. And importantly, based on these and observations over a few series of maps made by myself, what we found basically that habitat conservation, even though there is always room for more agreements, there are already 19 agreements dedicated to habitat, and we believe that developing any new agreement for habitat is going to take resources, and it's going to take political attention, it's going to take funding, it's going to take time, it's going to take energy. And what we believe is that in the case of habitat conservation, we believe that probably there are enough agreements, and especially when we consider the EAAFP, that we believe that perhaps the attention in the case of habitat should be on improving and strengthening implementation of what is already in place, taken as the main agreement, the EAAFP, and all the other agreements as supporting agreements. Whereas in the case of hunting, of course, we need to implement the ones that are in place, but we still need to fill that void that has been identified by this research. And of course, you already know this better than Rich, Tiffany, or I know, just because, of course, the task forces, both of the task forces are already working towards filling this particular institutional gap. So, and with that, just like to thank we can move on to the next one. Yeah, the many organizations and donors over the years that have funded this research, and the many people that have provided very important insights through semi-structured interviews that have been the core of this particular research. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm just happy to take any questions if there is time for any. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Tillman has his hand raised. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ed, for a very interesting presentation. Institutional design of the agreement, does it include aspects regarding the coverage, basically the number of parties the agreement has in the region you focused on?
Sorry.
How this is considered?
Sorry, it cut off a little bit. Would you mind repeating the question, plees?
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, it got better. Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering how is the number of parties or the coverage of member states of the agreement taken into account, in the sense that, I mean, for example, regarding hunting, is it included in what you called institutional design of the agreement, or because there are obviously differences? Say the EAAFP has many partners in the region, CMS has a still limited number of parties. I mean, countries which ratified the convention in the region. So how is this taken into account? CBD, for example, has a wider coverage than CMS in the region.
Yes, it does. So I guess it was a combination, I mean, of both. And that's why it was very important to understand, I mean, the distinction that we made between specialized agreements and more generic agreements. And the problem that basically what we found was that, I mean, that on the one hand, you have agreements that are probably way more relevant, such as the bilateral agreements, perhaps are the ones that have the most specific provisions when it comes to hunting management. And importantly, those bilateral agreements are basically their genesis really goes back to the very initial agreement signed between the US and Canada in 1916, which was very much focused on habitat, not even it was completely focused on hunting and not really on habitat at all. And what is interesting is that those agreements, those bilateral agreements, retain that feature. They added habitat to them, but they are very specific in terms of hunting. But again, the problem with those bilateral agreements is that they are bilateral. And as we can see from the hunting evidence, we know that this is really a multilateral issue. And likewise with CMS, CMS has some more degree of specificity, of course, would have much more value. But as you pointed out, the membership is very low in the region. So that leaves us still with a very huge gap. When we think about that, the CBD or Ramsar have very wide coverage. But in the case of Ramsar, Ramsar has no provisions for hunting, and the CBD has some provision that could be applicable, but taxonomically is way too generic to have any traction. So
I also have a question. So like you mentioned, hunting was not in every single thing. Did you see like a particular spike in some of the agreements adapting hunting as part of what they're covering, like at a certain point in time? Because I do know that also just in this region, there was a lot of focus for a long time on habitat-based conservation and not necessarily hunting, and that it was only recognized more recently in academia that hunting was like a major issue that needed more focus. Like, did you
wow,
know?
that's a very good question. That makes me think that that probably we missed running some other additional analysis. I would say, I mean, I will struggle a little bit with the numbers. I mean, I know that the most recent, the bilateral agreements, give or take, they are all pretty identical to one another. And they can't quite have some spread. Like they started in 1976, 1974. And the latest, I believe, was signed in 2016 between Russia and China. And to my understanding, there hasn't been any other sign. So those kind of have been kind of a spread over time. So I don't know if there would be a spike as such. That would be something that we could definitely look at more quantitatively, more robustly. But long story short, I believe that what to me is very interesting is that is the chicken or the egg to me, to what degree is how difficult it is to understand hunting at such a large spatial scale that didn't basically allow or basically didn't drive the development of an agreement that would take into account hunting. It is a very big issue to me. I mean, the issue of hunting to me is an issue of detection and aggregation. And at such a large spatial scale, it's just very difficult to get around that. And without the understanding of hunting, then it's very difficult to make a case to include it in a multilateral agreement. So, yeah.
Mark, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks, Susan. I was just interested, Ed, if you found any differences between the legally binding agreements and the voluntary non-binding initiative. So you've mentioned the Flyway Partnership a couple of times. That's a voluntary non-binding initiative, but then that you also presented a lot on the legally binding multilateral environment agreements and also the bilat agreements. Was there a difference in some of the analysis that you did between those two formats?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not in relation to effectiveness and how they may vary in terms of like their implementation, for instance. But they definitely had a very stark contrast in relation to the type of actors involved and in relation to how prevalent was one type against the other across the two architectures or the two frameworks. And basically what we found is that governance has a combination, has a mix. In the case of habitat, there is a mix of voluntary and legally binding agreements that, of course, in the case of habitat, those voluntary agreements allow for the inclusion of non-state actors. In the case of hunting, what we found is that they are strictly speaking legally binding, and they are strictly speaking, of course, by definition, only encompassing the nation state, basically national governments being at the table. Why that's the case? What is driving that difference? We're still figuring out what is driving that difference. But yeah, we know from other cases, in the case of North America, the case is very similar. Hunting is also very much restricted in terms of rulemaking, is pretty much restricted to governments. In the case of the US, of course, there is some degree of participation of the state governments, not just federal government, but state governments. But the flyway councils in North America is a process that is pretty much restricted to governments. The case of habitat is really mixed as well. It's very similar to the case of the East Asian Australasian flyway. So in North America, we see a very similar pattern that follows it basically follows the same pattern as the EAAF. What is driving that is something that we don't know.
Okay, Vicky, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Ed. That was really interesting talk. Some amazing diagrams there. I just wanted to ask you there's obviously a big gap between signing an agreement and then actually implementing it effectively. So I was wondering whether you have thought about whether you could bring in measures of implementation somehow, like using national reports to conventions or whatever. Yeah, have you thought about using a measure of degree of implementation?
Yeah, I did some work on that is not included here and is not published. Looking at variations in implementation. I mean, implementation has so many layers and it's very difficult to really, basically you have a trade-off between how much depth you have in your analysis and how much breadth you have in terms of your spatial coverage. So basically, what I did was looking at 3 particular cases. So the case of China, the US, and Australia. And it was looking basically at national level implementation as on how much it gets implemented through national laws. And in the case of those particular 3 countries, the country where there is a thicker or a higher level of implementation given by national policies really is the US. And I bet in my preliminary analysis points out to the fact that there is a lot of overlap with duck hunting. Basically, that ducks is what may be driving that level of implementation. Interestingly, the case of China is a little bit more similar to the case of the US, but we believe that maybe the hunting model of North America drives much more that than in the case of China. Basically, China doesn't really follow that same model. So basically, you have a very strong political constituency in the case of the hunting community, the waterfowl hunting community in North America. In the case of Australia pretty much by definition has no international migratory ducks, basically. And that creates so it's an interaction basically of those two. Now, I'm not so sure I'm really answering your question in terms of how much is actually any of those agreements being implemented on the ground, what they mean for on-the-ground actions. We did an analysis, not of international agreements, but of conservation plans for migratory shorebirds at various levels, regionally, nationally, and internationally in the Pacific Northwest, in the Puget Sound region in Seattle. That is not related to the EAAF, but it provides an example. And basically what we found is that there is very little evidence that any of those conservation plans actually is influencing what management, what site managers do on the ground. They're definitely doing some conservation actions for shorebirds, but they are not really drawing demand. They are not really working under the mandate of those conservation plans. They're drawing their mandate from somewhere else.
Yvonne, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ed, for a wonderful presentation. And my question was a bit linked to what Vicky just mentioned. So I mean, I'm a bit shocked also what you just said about the action plans and the application on the ground and how they can influence. So my question is really, have you been able to identify gaps at the level of countries or species? I mean, so you were assessing the connection and the coverage, let's say, of these conventions. And I wonder how to translate that into recommendations to countries, or even parties, in the case of the CMS, or non-parties, Um, is there a possibility to understand from that analysis whether, a particular ex-country, would benefit from either stricter regulations or signing agreements that are more into hunting, while others, may have a good coverage, but still, or the message would be that they require better implementation? I mean, is there any way of translating that into key, let's say, policy messages that we at the conventions can take?
Yeah, I think to me, I mean, from the perspective of resilience, and to me, when you think about, for instance, that Australia is a signatory to 3 bilateral agreements, but they are all centralized in the way they are, or streamlined in the way they are implemented nationally. So basically, that means that you could remove 1 or even 2 of those agreements, and the mechanism for national implementation would still remain in place. So it matters. So having multiple agreements in the case of Australia, multiple bilateral agreements matters insofar you are influencing multiple countries. But as far as implementation goes within Australia, having 1, having 3, having 4 is the same. And probably Mark would have more to add to that, because at the end of the day, they all get streamlined through through the same piece of implementation nationally. Now, what I'm trying to get at with that is talking about the idea of how robust the system is. And basically, what I believe is that having more agreements, basically, it would take more agreements to fail for the whole system to collapse, on the one hand. On the other, having multiple agreements allows for more venues, basically more levers of policy making or decision making, places where more NGOs can go to, places where more researchers can go to influence decision making. Sometimes some of these agreements have focal points that are hosted by different agencies or different ministries, different departments within governments, and that means that you are reaching different parts of decision making within government. That, to me, just adds to how robust the system is. Now, in terms of specific recommendations, to me, the very overarching one to me is that there has been just I wouldn't say too many, but I think we should really try to stop encouraging more agreements for habitat. And that's very clear that what has driven that number of agreements has been habitat loss. A lot of those agreements converge in the Yellow Sea. A lot of those habitat agreements converge in the Yellow Sea, and that's unsurprising. But to me, my point is, like, do we really need more of those agreements? We need to better implement what is already in place, because there is a trade-off there. In the case of hunting, I think we truly need to move in the direction that these 2 task forces are going, to really fill that void, that gap, at the flyway level. In terms of regions, specific regions, I think Southeast Asia is a region that is very important for many species that do not necessarily reach Australia. Spoonbill sandpiper being a very good example of that. Asian Dawichao that reach Australia in lower numbers, and Southeast Asia has a very low representation of those international agreements. So I know that has been redressed. There is, the Southeast Asian network is redressing some of those issues, but that's definitely an area that requires some attention, I would say.
Thank you. Very useful.
And Mark, you had your hand up to respond to that asked question.
Possibly, although I could add to it. I think Australia has 3 bilateral migratory bird agreements, one with Japan, the other with China, and the last one with Korea. But we were actually, Australia was actually negotiating a whole bunch of others back in the 1990s, but just didn't reach their conclusion. So we were negotiating agreements with Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. I think Vietnam was one. and I think Russia as well. But for whatever reason, they never finished. They never got signed. So yeah, it could have been a much different architecture if they had been concluded. But my question to Ed was, your analysis was largely based on waterbirds, migratory waterbirds. Do you think you would have found different results with maybe migratory land birds or raptors in your analysis?
This is very interesting. Yeah, I think the result would have been different. I mean, on the one hand, I would argue then that yeah, there is a degree of overlap, of taxonomic overlap across some of these agreements. Like the bilaterals is a very good example. Bilateral do not discriminate, right? They just cover the full suite of species, generally speaking. So those to me would be like no problem at all. To me, the issue in terms of answering the question that you just asked me would be in relation to those agreements that restrict their focus to migratory waterbirds. That's the case of like the Ramsar Convention or the EAAFP. Now, my preliminary, is not my anecdotal observation of the region is that there is no equivalent to migratory raptors, for instance, something similar to the raptors MOU, right, in this part of the world. And to me, that's really begging a huge question for doing similar research for other groups. In the case of landbirds, yeah, I think those two groups are like, if we think there is a gap here in the case of migratory waterbirds and that we need to be concerned about it, in the case of landbirds and of raptors, I would say that probably if we were to conduct the analysis robustly, I would say that the results are going to be even more worrying in terms of the gaps. But I don't have like, a definite answer to that. But my hunch based on my anecdotal observations is that the gaps would be much higher.
And maybe that's something the Flyways working group can pick up in their gaps analysis.
Yeah, and here in the Americas, it's a very similar situation. Like for raptors, there is nothing really that is equivalent to the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network as an example. So if anything, shorebirds are really, further along, I would say.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ed, for doing this, and thank you for staying up so late so that you can present. That was a really great discussion, and I hope that everybody can follow up with Ed if they're interested in this topic more. I would just like to make sure that we have enough time to move along to the resolutions, but round of applause for Ed first before we move on to the next agenda item. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
so am I okay? Sorry, Susan, just to confirm, am I okay to stay for the rest of the meeting?
Yeah, you can stay.
Okay, right.
If you have time, if you can stay, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I don't want to
had
force
enough
you
coffee,
because I
so
know
yeah.
it is midnight. It is midnight or 1, I forget where you are. So I will let Yvonne take it away, but let me share the other screen so that we can get our talk up first. Okay.
Okay, should I start?
Yeah, you can start.
Okay, just a minute. Yeah, so again, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you to all of you in different parts of the globe for attending this webinar. This is really great, and I am sure that also since it's being recorded, other people can benefit from this. The idea from this little talk is to give you an overview of the things that have happened since our COP, and especially what are the mandates and let's say publications or steps that we are taking at the CMS Secretariat in view of a really short intersessional period, because as you probably know, the plans are to have the COP already in the first half of 2026, which means that we have literally 1 year to go in terms of delivering our work and implementing our mandate before we have to report back to the next COP. So the idea is just to give you a bit of an overview, but of course, really happy to hear from any questions and clarify any doubts that you have. The first slide that we are showing here relates to Resolution 14.4, and that was the first ever published report on the state of the world migratory species. And no need to repeat what was said in Samarkand, but basically, again, to leave here the link of the report. More importantly, to highlight that this report is full of diagrams and graphs and infographics that I think really justify the case of the Asia-Pacific Task Force against the illegal killing of birds. You see here in the graphs that we put that you see that the CMS listed species, the proportion of species affected by overexploitation is basically the top one. And that also repeats to all migratory species, including CMS species. So we are dealing with a top threat for migratory species, including birds, of course. The graph that you see here is for all species, not just birds. But this is why we need to focus on this. And I would really encourage you to have a look at the report because it has really good overview also by region, by group of species, and the measures. And this is our baseline. This is how we are now going to measure the progress of the implementation of the convention. I'm linking to the talk that Eduardo just gave. The idea is that we will be adapting also thanks to the SPMS, the Samarkand strategic plan. We will be adapting the way that we work, and we will be tailoring the agreements and the work that we do to make sure that they report back, and we can show progress in addressing these threats. In the particular case of this graph here, by the next COP and the COPs to come. So that's the idea, and I really encourage you to have a look at this one. Next, please. Of course, you know, the one resolution that really deals with the work of Asia Pacific Task Force is the 1131 illegal and unsustainable take of wildlife, together with the resolutions that we have that become the framework of the MIC, the Asia Pacific, and others. But this one was now, let's say, launched in Samarkand. And to cut the story short, what we want to make sure is that we will have over the time a new initiative in the frame of the CMS that will be an overarching initiative addressing any kind of illegal and unsustainable take. At the moment, you know, thanks to Resolution 1611 and others that, you know, have been working on or have been providing the mandate for task forces like Asia Pacific or MICT, or now the Southwest Asia Task Force that we are about to launch. We have been making a lot of progress in terms of the birds, let's say, on the addressing the threats of illegal killing of birds. But the parties identified the need to have a bit of a more overarching initiative. So the idea is that under this illegal and sustainable taking initiative, we will have a working group reporting under the Scientific Council, and we will be having soon a coordinator that will assist with implementation and support of these synergies that we could find between the task forces that we have, like Asia Pacific, but also others that maybe in the future be developing or that address all the taxa, you know, including aquatic species and terrestrial species. I really encourage you to have a look at this mandate and especially, you know, the next steps. I mean, in principle, I think that we will be able to advertise for the coordination of this position very soon. And the idea is that this coordination will help us to find these synergies and gaps. So we will try to enhance cooperation amongst institutions. We will analyze the drivers, the scale, and the impacts of illegal and unsustainable take of CMS listed species. Again, this is not only for birds, this is for all the species. The idea is to develop guidance materials and develop case studies. Also to look into the legal take, but in those cases that the legal take becomes unsustainable. So, in other words, to develop models for adaptive harvest management. So this is something that is being launched now, let's say. I mean, it was presented in Samarkand, but now we are really going into it. We have funding from some parties that are happy for us to make progress on this. And the avian team is going to be quite involved in this because of our experience in the task forces on illegal killing. And I think that, I mean, it's important to understand how this will evolve. This, of course, depends on the parties, but probably what we are seeing is that in the future, maybe not in the next COP, but in the COPs to come, we will have this initiative as the one that, you know, coordinates the different task forces that are more species specific. And therefore, you know, we have a place to discuss and to have guidance that applies to not only birds, but to other taxa. So more than happy to answer any questions on this one. Next, please. Similarly, I mean, we do now have a new, let's say, revised version of the Resolution 1211 revised in COP14, the flyways resolution, and also new decisions 14137 to 142. And again, to cut the story short, you have here a quick description, and I think Mark already mentioned, that the Flyways Working Group new subgroups or task groups could really help to move the agenda also in this part of the world, in Asia Pacific. I think that the bottom line is that we revised the resolution because, as you probably know, it was such a big and vast approach for flyways that we tried to streamline to a bit, and make sure that we were having, current references, and also to redefine a bit more the role of the Flyways Working Group. The Flyways Working Group has been, as I said, redefined in the way that we want it to be, or the parties want it to be, a group that can coordinate or at least have an overview of the different partnerships, CMS and not CMS, that are working at flyway level. So let's call it, a hub or a place where we can connect all this work and then make sure that we identify common synergies and identify gaps. And that's how the Flyways Working Group is now working. We had an online meeting earlier this year, and then kind of an official meeting, but a still quite relevant meeting happening in just a few weeks' time here in Bonn because of the Scientific Council. And there was the decision to establish task groups that will work on specific needs. So, for example, for this one, the review of the program of work is fundamental. We want to have a new program of work for the Flyways Working Group that should also identify gaps and priorities, but also we want to develop a working group that deals with other instruments and how we can make sure that we connect with them, and also what are the resources that we can provide, what are the resources that exist and we can connect. So for parties that are in Americas, in Asia, in Africa, etc. And that's the second working group. And the third one would be on seabirds, because it was identified that one of the key needs for the CMS as a whole, to be honest, but also within the flyways, is to give more relevance to seabirds, the seabird flyways, and the seabird needs. More than happy to hear, if anybody wants to be part of these working groups, and the chair is Rob Clay, or ourselves in the Secretariat. So anybody who is interested in becoming part of these working groups or these task groups, please let us know. That's basically it for this, but just to say that on top of this, of course, you will see many references to the Samarkand strategic plan. This is the new strategic plan for the convention. This will go until 2032. And while it was presented and approved in Samarkand in Uzbekistan, we are trying to move as fast as we can to have the first set of indicators presented for the next COP in 2026. This means that we will now be developing a series of workshops under a working group under the standing committee. And the idea will be that we are able to identify indicators for each of the goals and the targets that were presented in the Samarkand plan, because at the end, what the ideal scenario would be is that any single agreement under the CMS or our program of work can report back and can contribute to these indicators. So when the time comes to report progress against the convention, we can use the structures that we have now to see whether we have moved or not. So that's what we are doing now, and we are hoping again that this intersessional working group will resume its work in the next weeks or months. Thank you. Next. And the last that I will cover from my side is the launch of the Central Asian Flyway Initiative. This has been sponsored by the government of India, but of course, it covers a huge number of countries, and you can see here those that are also not just range states, but that have an overlap with EAAFP. This is a really nice initiative that we hope can move along before the next COP in terms of, confirming the coordination unit. For you to know that the idea is that we will have a coordination unit, so a physical office, let's say, based in India with their support, and with UN CMS Secretariat staff based there, with the idea to coordinate the entire program of work of the Central Asian Flyway. This comes at a time when we are also dealing with the launch of a new task force similar to the Asia Pacific one for Southwest Asia, this time with the support of the government of Saudi Arabia. We are discussing how to launch it, but most probably the launch is going to happen in January next year. And the idea then is to have all the countries in the region working in a similar way to those that are part of the Asia Pacific Task Force. But together with the CAF, we think that we are really going to address the gap, the historical gap that the CMS had in the region. Hopefully, this will be supporting more parties joining the convention, and as you can understand, there will be a lot of overlap in terms of the issues that we will address because the threats are common, as we saw in the first slide. So illegal and unsustainable take is going to be one of the top threats for both the Central Asia Flyway Initiative and for the task force of the Southwest Asia illegal killing. So that's it from my side. I think the next slides are on you, Susan, but happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Yeah, let's go through the rest of them first before we take any questions. So I would just like to reiterate for Resolution 12.12, which was related to action plans for birds, that there are 3 new ones that are very relevant to folks who are in this region for the Christmas Island frigate bird, the great bustard, and the yellow-breasted bunting. And these are all, they cover a lot of ground related to these species and also have a lot of recommendations in some cases that might be relevant to some folks' government offices or other agenda setting that might be coming up. So I do encourage everyone to check those out. And then also towards the end of 2023, there was the multi-species action plan to conserve vultures that came out, of which Chris Bowden is the Asian regional coordinator. And some of the parts that are relevant to participants here are, developing partnerships with anti-poaching initiatives that are concerning poisoning, actively engaging with the other task forces in the CMS in the region, and also encouraging folks to let the Secretariat know when they've carried out any sort of implementation activities related to the vultures. Umberto is actually here, so I wanted to see if he has anything that he would like to push forward to encourage people to participate in this.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Good morning, good evening to everybody. Yes, I just want to add that based on the decision out of COP14, there will be a notification going out very soon regarding the establishment of a working group, a call for membership of the working group on to support the implementation of the multi-species action plan for vultures, and it will be organized also in regional committees. And in particular for Southeast Asia, it goes over the limit of the geographical scope of the Raptor MOU, who has been the coordinator unit of which has been taking care of coordinated implementation of the action plan. So definitely we would like to have participants and members also from Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and so on, where there are vultures, but we don't really have through CMS a connection. So the notification will be extended also to the members of ITTEA and the East Asian Australasian Flyway partnership, so that we can cover properly this area as well.
Thanks, Eduardo. And then 11.16, the prevention of illegal killing, taking, and trade of migratory birds. So these 2 particular decisions are related to the formation and implementation of the task forces. So previously the text for ITTEA was that we needed to form, and now we need to implement and support and, do things. And also the new one that Yvonne mentioned earlier with the Southwest Asia Task Force for illegal taking of migratory birds, that one has also been forming, and hopefully there will be a coordinator or a colleague that we will be working with soon. And much like how I coordinate with Clary, hopefully we'll have another person who will be participating in some of these discussions so that we have a more complete global view. What I do want to also really highlight, though, is the decision related to 14.123, which is the global analysis on production, sale, use, and regulation of mist nets. And this is directed towards the Scientific Council, but I think that there are actually steps within it that are relevant to parties and non-parties and NGOs just because of the data that's necessary for it. So I'll go over that in the next slide. We are hopefully going to be starting this analysis soon, since there was a donor that was secured to do this work. And this really is relevant to ITTEA, considering that in 2 of our objectives, we have, understanding the scale and the scope of illegal take requires that we understand the mist nets and traps that are used, and also for then developing national legislative frameworks that address this as a threat. So, and this is relevant to the fact that there are hunting regulations that may be necessary to be made. So specifically, the first 3 elements in that are compile data on global scale of use of nets for illegal taking of birds, identify where mist nets are produced and sold, and produce an overview of national legislation, regulating production, sale, possession, and use of mist nets and other sorts of nets. And through my understanding, there are no documentations in some cases for some of the range states in the EAAF that have, all of this information in one place. And so even though this is directed to the scientific committee, this is probably information that they will ask for from folks. And so I do encourage people to think about these questions and potentially maybe gather some of that back. At the very least, if there is no data for your country, even going through if there are any national legislation that covers this aspect of it, if there are none, I think that's really good information for us to know instead of just having that as missing. So clarifying that is, I think, very important when they do this global analysis. And in some cases also, because the production of mist nets and selling of mist nets are not very highly regulated, even those kind of informal types of production and sale would be good to know about. So, don't just think about only the more formal structures, but I think that there's a lot of use on the informal end as well, just from working in this region for almost 15 years now. And, from this global analysis, hopefully that they will be able to produce guidance that can be helpful for everybody. And I know that in this region, there is definitely a high need for that. So at the very least, you can gather the information to tell us that, hey, we don't really know very much and we would like this guidance so that we can actually go ahead and put that forward. I think that'd be really helpful to a lot of people who work in different government offices. Okay, and then specifically to the ITTEA, I just want to, okay, before I move on, are there any questions related to the Are there any questions related to the decisions and resolutions from the CMS? I just want to give anyone an opportunity if they want to ask anything first. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks, Susan. Just on that last point around the global situation analysis on the mist nets, is that moving ahead, or is that subject to available resources?
I can take it one if you want. Yeah, it's moving ahead thanks to the support of some parties that have helped us to carry out this. So we are now in the process of finalizing this internal agreement, let's say, with the party who wants to support this. And then we've been talking to some implementing partners, and the idea is that we are able to launch it still this year, with the idea of having the results in the first half of next year. I mean, it will not be, allow me to say, the super ideal analysis that we always dreamed about, because of course, funding limitations have these things. But I'm quite confident that we can deliver, a good proportion of the tasks under the mandate, and I think it would be a really, really important analysis that can help us to guide next steps.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ivan.
Are there any other questions from anybody? If you don't feel comfortable raising your hand speaking, you can also type in the chat. I will read the question out. Okay. If there's no questions, I'm going to move ahead to quickly discussing the updates from the ITTEA. So let's go back to sharing desktop. Okay, so first of all, since the last time we met, there have been many folks who have joined as new members from different government agencies in Mongolia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, and some of whom are in attendance today, some of whom will hopefully be able to attend another time. And I am very much, glad that there's more government input on this, because obviously I've worked with a lot of folks in these government offices, and seeing that there is now an avenue for us to communicate more officially in order to actually get at this issue of illegal taking, I think is really helpful, because we can share resources a lot more easily and also understand this more comprehensive view of the region. So thank you everybody for joining us. And then I'm going to cover 3 activities that we're going to be doing in the ITTEA in the upcoming year. The scoreboard development, guidance documents for market surveys, and then also expansion of surveys for baseline assessments. So first of all, the scoreboard is something that we have talked about as something very key to ITTEA as a way for us to be able to self-assess. And so we are going to begin that development. I've been in contact with Ding Li about this for quite some time also, and how we want to work this out. And currently our timeline, our goal is to start that self-assessment, that development in early 2025. And BirdLife will have somebody who will liaise with regional experts and myself for consultation on the indicator framework. You can see an example of the previous scoreboard from MICT at the link below. And that one is not something that is appropriate to this region, but is a really good model for what we can do for the kinds of things we can be asking. But we do need to broaden some of the scope to capture the different levels at which people are operating in this region. By Q3, we want to have at least one online meeting that will allow all of you to give feedback on a draft scoreboard. And also that will be circulated to all the members via email as well. So you can always send feedback through email as well. And hopefully that will allow us to then, at the EAAFP MOP in the Philippines in November 2025, we can actually present it and also if you talk about it. And if there are any final things that need to be, changes that need to be made, that can be done. But hopefully there is a near final version that will be available at the EAAFP MOP. And then by the end of 2025, then we will have the guidance document for how to use it along with the final version of the scoreboard completed and online and available to everybody. We will really value the input of everybody from here, because obviously there are some situations that may be very unique to certain countries that we might have thought of as in terms of how we're capturing it in scoreboards. And so we want to make sure that you are able to have your voice heard, to make sure that it actually is able to capture the work that everybody's doing. And we will I'll probably be the one to email everybody to set up a meeting where we can all come together and hopefully be able to discuss that in greater detail. And then the second thing is a guidance document for market surveys, which is really something that we need to have in a more formalized format, basically, practical guidelines for standardized protocols for market surveys covering, reconnaissance surveys, sampling, structure questionnaires, interviewing, analysis of data, and strategic approaches for accounting for cultural and legal sensitivities. And we discussed this previously in a workshop, but there's not really a document that is just one thing that you can give to somebody to basically say, here's where you can start learning what you need to do and setting up your study and going out and actually structuring an experiment or studying a survey by yourself. And I do think that's really necessary because I do know there are a lot of data gaps in this region that require this kind of guidance, especially for students or early career scientists who are just starting out and don't have as much experience. And I do think that having some of this in different languages will rely very much, hopefully, on the efforts of folks in the task force so that it can be disseminated more widely. We will have a draft version that will be disseminated for comment in Q3 of 2025, and hopefully have a finalized version for the EAAFP MOP in November, much like the scoreboard. So those two things will hopefully be done by the end of this year. The other part, though, is that we need to have an expansion of surveys for baseline assessments. We actually don't have enough data in some cases to make baselines, or we are only collecting the data that we need now to have enough points to make a good baseline. And so, for instance, in 2025, we are going to continue working with the Malaysian Nature Society Kuching Branch to expand their surveys in Sarawak. And I'm actually going to have them present after this to give a little update about their work there. Their report has been online, but I also just want to make sure people had time to really digest the information that they found and also give them an example of the kinds of things that are the very step zero almost before you even make baselines, before you can go ahead. So it'll give hopefully some encouragement for everybody to take some steps to doing their own baselines. And then in late 2025, we're going to start again with BirdLife. Again, talk to Dingley about this. And then into 2026, working in Sulawesi, Nusa Tenggara, and then also the Philippines and Lao PDR. And BirdLife will be working with some of their local partners in this case, but also I have talked to Dingley about connecting more with the government folks as well. So I have reached out to some of you already before to discuss this, but I will continue doing so to hopefully make sure that we have a good partnership between everybody and that everybody gets something out of it and that the information is shared appropriately also with the agencies that need it. And hopefully from the combined data that is taken from all these surveys, in the population sizes and hunting and threats and market prevalence and, modeling, that helps us create an actual baseline from this, because we really have a big data gap issue in this region as one of the major impediments for progressing with making a proper baseline. And the aim is to at least complete some of these by the end of 2026 so that we have in these very key areas with high biodiversity and potentially a lot of threats related to overexploitation, that we have something in line for us to know what we're comparing to as we go forward and work on this issue. And to reiterate something that Mark mentioned earlier, the EAAFP MOP is in the Philippines in November 2025. And the DNR is our lovely host for that. It is also coincidentally near the final CMS Scientific Council session before COP15. And so they have a technical review of relevant COP15 documents. And if people are interested, we can also host an online meeting for discussion related to any documents or resolutions people are interested in bringing forth. And we can convene to review all of that for anybody who is interested. You don't have to necessarily be a party necessarily, but it might cover something that is relevant to you as a range, state in this region. So, if you're able to attend, please come. At the very least, online, let us know if there are any things that you are interested in. And I'm just gonna very quickly thank everybody for your time and also put all of our emails up there in case you need to contact us about anything again. I will also add Umberto's email to this before I put this online. But yeah, I'll take any questions from anybody before we move on to our next agenda item. Are there any questions? Yes, Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering in relation to the national baselines, whether you're looking to get full sort of national scale estimates of the issue, or more like a subsample to use as a kind of ongoing indicator.
Yeah, so I think that because of the decentralization issue, it makes more sense to go towards these areas where there's already kind of high levels of market and overexploitation issues, and use that as a target area first. I don't think, to be honest, realistically, there will be the ability within the time frame that we have to do like a full national for like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. That's just too large of a region within each of those countries, along with the fact that they are rather decentralized in their governance structure, that it doesn't really make sense to push them to do this at a national level. I think we need to have a lot of folks working from regions where we know these are really big issues, and then moving upward on the scale, working first with folks who are on that regency level, and then to the province level, and working with them in different areas. Because once you have multiple studies in different regencies, it's easier to bring all of them together to get this like kind of island-wide referendum on certain topics, and it makes it a little bit easier to then push for the broader countrywide one, because then you can demonstrate that this is something that's operational. And that's also necessary, I think, because as the fact that CMS is not very familiar to a lot of people in this region, I think we need to be doing this also as a proof of concept in some ways, because it's really something that is very necessary, but a lot of people don't do because it's not exciting in some ways, but it is their job. And so I'm hoping to really see that there is more of this work being taken up by having us lead by example in many ways. And hopefully that'll encourage more people to go out there and do the basic science necessary so that we can actually make some baselines even. Yeah, are there any other questions? No? Okay. So moving on to the next section. So thank you everybody for that. I will now open the part of the meeting where we're going to allow folks who are participating to give updates. And actually first I wanted to recognize that the folks from the Malaysian Nature Society Kuching Branch are here to give a short presentation about their study. And so I will let Olivia speak now, and I will just share my screen again for her talk.
Thanks, Susan. I'm actually speaking today on behalf of Malaysian Nature Society Kuching Branch. Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I'll just go straight into it. So this is the project that we concluded last year on the Far Eastern Curlew on the Sarawak coastline. Next slide, please. Right. So the purpose of this project was to clarify the status of Far Eastern Curlew on the Malaysian Borneo coastline, as we have historical data that shows how important Sarawak is for Far Eastern Curlew. Next. This is just a Google map to show where the Sarawak coast is. So we have the Sarawak in Kuching site on the westernmost of the North Borneo until reaching Brunei, and one of the sites is actually located in between Brunei and Sarawak. Okay, next. All right, so let's dive right into the results. So these are the numbers where we found presence of Far Eastern Curlew. So we actually tried to go to a lot of the sites along the coast but we only managed to go to a few due to the tidal and the coastal circumstances. And we found presence of Far Eastern Curlew at 6 sites all over the coast, with the highest being the Mammoth Wetland, which is an ash pond. Here, Sejingkat Ash Pond, with the highest count having at 901 individuals of Far Eastern Curlew, followed by Buntal Bay, which is an intertidal coastal sandflat with slightly over 600 individuals recorded during our survey. And then the third highest was in the Tristan Sundar, which is located between Sarawak, Sabah, which is the Malaysian part, and also the Brunei waters. So we have the 3 least numbers of Far Eastern Curlew in Batang Maro, Matu Sandbar, and Pulau Patok, where all 3 recorded less than 100 individuals. Next, please. So this is just a comparison between our project with CMS in 2023 and other published surveys and reports from the 1980s to 2020. So some sites shown to be experiencing a decline, while others show an increase in the number of Far Eastern Curlew. So here we have the Sejingkat Ash Pond, the newly found sandbar, which is the Matu Sandbar here. And Tristan Sundar shows an increase in number. But for Pulau Berit Patok area, which is unfortunate because they show a really rapid decline in number due to the dynamic cost of that site and also a lot of changes in the habitat itself. You can see the map on the top. You can see the tidal wetland gain has now almost joined the 2 islands together. So they no longer house huge congregations of shorebirds. Next, please. So this is just to show you the total number of Far Eastern Curlew and Eurasian curlews at Sejingkat and Buntal Bay, because these 2 are seem to be the most important site for Far Eastern Curlews. But of course, to note that the counts were conducted at tides that are suitable for this site, and the highest count of Far Eastern Curlew was recorded during their arrival in November. For Buntal, but for Sejingkat Ash Pond, the number actually was quite low in the beginning. But this also could be due to the fact that for the previous season, there were no migratory shorebirds utilizing the ash ponds due to construction activity. But then they slowly come back for this particular season. Yeah, next slide, please. So it's just to conclude, Sarawak is definitely an important site for Far Eastern Curlew, especially in the Southeast Asia region. And the ash pond is still one of the most important sites for this bird here in Sarawak. And I think the findings in Tristan Sundar, which recorded almost quadruple the number as compared in the 2011 survey, which is also important to ensure that we continue to monitor the habitat and identify sites of importance. That is all from me. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Batrisyia? Okay, and again, you can read their full report. It's already linked on the ITTEA website. And if there are any other folks who would like to share if there are any updates related to implementation or things that are upcoming in their region, in their country, or if there are other specific species that any of you are focusing on, please feel free to raise your hand and let any of us know. There are no updates from anything. And you can also type in the chat if you're not comfortable speaking in front of a group. Nope. I don't think there is. Okay. Okay, Vicky says she's wondering if there are immediate threats to those sites or are all of them okay? Patricia?
Yep, thank you for the comment and question. So as of throughout all my survey periods that have been conducted there since, I would say, 2018, I have not seen any threats whatsoever, except for the fact that maybe the occasional construction going on near the ash pond makes the birds not wanting to roost there and try to find other habitat. But unfortunately, recently, the team on the ground has found some mist nets in the ash pond and caught a few unlucky shorebirds. But now that they have also reported it to the government, and MNS and also Sarawak Forestry Corporation has been will regularly check the sites. Yeah.
This is Rose here from MNS Kuching Branch. We are now in talk with the landowners of Sejingkat Ash Pond. They are harvesting the ash tray, the ashes. So we are trying to see, talking to the engineers and doing rapid assessments this November for 5 days, day and night, together with them on how they're going to harvest, because they don't know how to manage, or they have never actually managed the Sejingkat ash pond. Neither do we have the experience, but we're also getting a little bit of help from Australia and BirdLife in UK for the advice and support. We have had a workshop with them. They are very keen to save the site, but we don't know how far it will go. So we are having a talk with them on the 17th of this month and taking them to the site, actually, and showing them the importance, and also showing the video introduction to the East Asian Australasian flyway, which they have very little knowledge about it. So it's not considered as a threat, but should we lose the site, then we don't know what's going to happen to the birds. Perhaps they go elsewhere. But for now, like Batrisyia said, the Sejingkat Ash Pond has been the most important roosting site for the shorebirds, 10 kilometers away from Bakubunta Bay. But we are working on it with the Sejingkat Ash Pond owners.
Earlier, you mentioned that you found some mist nets. Do you know who the consumers could potentially be collecting them, or is it just people are trying to get rid of them because they think the birds are a nuisance or something else?
We have had a report. 2 of our members just happened to go birding at the site. This was last week. And we have never, very rarely, in fact, I have never had any reports of mist nets. Previous to that, many, many years ago, but that's just isolated case. But this one time, they took down the mist nets, and there were about 5 birds that were caught in it. They cut the nets and released the birds. 1 or 2, the legs were injured and could not fly. So we report this immediately to the authorities, who wanted to come down, but from the office to Sejingkat Ash Pond is quite away. And we just sort of reported the incident to the Sejingkat Ash Pond station, the power station. And the Sarawak government is very serious. In fact, there is some sort of a regulation on the sale of mist nets. We're not allowed to buy mist nets, but then fishermen buy them at the hardware shop. I'm not absolutely sure. So it was interesting that you were talking about it just now, Susan, about regulating it, something that we can share with our government.
Yeah,
the Sarawak Forestry government is relying on MNS with such things, and we are relying on BirdLife International and people like you to guide us. And also the thing on analysis, data collection, report writing, on the market survey, that form will be very interesting. We are very interested in things like that to let our young surveyors use them so that there is proper reporting.
Yeah, for sure. And those skills are very much transferable to if they choose to be in academia or if they choose to continue working at NGOs or in the government. So yeah.
I don't think there is any way we could get any sort of training from BirdLife at this moment. So that's something we're looking forward to hear from you.
Ivan, you had a comment?
Yeah, thanks, Rose. Yeah, a couple of comments really on the mist nets. I was going to say that this kind of information and your support, the local expertise to understand what is the regulation, what is the accessibility, whether they are used by the birding community or not only the farmers and etc. will be fundamental to understand. We are, as I said, finalizing the agreement with implementing partner, and then we hope that a survey is sent out, but it will have to be necessarily an online questionnaire. So any kind of information that we can receive, and then maybe just talk about some specific case examples, that would be fantastic. So, for example, this one on the Far Eastern Curlew, I can really see that can feature in the report. So on the misnets, any kind of information or questions that you may have, please reach out to us, because we really want to have the most comprehensive analysis possible. But I'm also curious about what Rose mentioned on the ash. Sorry for my ignorance, but just to understand, so you mentioned that people were going to collect ashes, or did I understood wrongly?
From the ash pond, yes.
That is what she said, to collect the ash
Yeah.
from the ash
So
pond,
this
yes.
is collecting ash as a fertilizer or something like that?
For apparently this ash is very good for making bricks, which they would use for the dams, for the
For the
hydro
dams.
They're using it to
Yeah.
make bricks that go into the dams, because
Bricks.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand now.
They are very strong, apparently. So we're seeing
I
if
see.
they are working on pond number 1, they'll move on to pond number 2. We will see how deep that will go and whether the birds can still come and use the first pond that they have harvested. So we are working with the engineers and contractors on that.
Okay,
then
thank you.
Make a report to the management. They want us to do it for them.
Thank you.
So I think one of the birds caught was a curlew, Far Eastern Curlew. Was it that, Olivia? Can you confirm?
No, sorry, just jump in, but it's Wimbrel Rose.
Oh, it's Wimber. Sorry. Yeah.
And I will mention that Batrisyia put in the chat that the birds prefer to use the active ash pond compared to the other ponds. So, it would be good to clarify what's going on with the harvest of ashland in these places.
We have been there 2 weeks ago. Right now, the birds are coming, but because of the construction work and the foundation work going on, and so it is important for us to do this 5 days rapid assessment together with the management to see, how the birds are affected. But when we were there was sounds, noise, the contractors working, but there were still birds, although not a lot. So we need to monitor that.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that even though mist nets are regulated, a lot of fishermen also buy nets. And I've actually seen that in some other places in Southeast Asia also, where they repurpose old fishing nets. So I think when the global net survey comes out, it would be useful to know if people are using other kinds of traps as well, not just like mist nets only, as part of that, because I do know there's a lot of homemade methods that people use in Southeast Asia if they can't get their hand on nets anyway, because mist nets are not as commonly sold everywhere. So I think any of that kind of information is also still very relevant and would be good for anybody who is working in this kind of space to keep track of. I'll give an example also. Just in other places, we also take signs of any sort of hunting. So anything related to human use of traps, we also always take that data regardless of what it is used for, and then figure out a lot of what it is actually used for later also. So it is just useful to keep track of if there is a lot of these signs of hunting approaching that area too. Ed, you have a hand raised.
We have done 1-year survey outside of Kuching. In other parts, as you know, Sarawak is still quite forested. Yes, people were using traps and also using, what do you call that? The sticky rubber.
The glue
that they put
one,
on the branches, and the birds will come and perch on them and get caught.
The glue
these
traps,
are jungle birds.
Yeah.
We are also losing our forest birds.
Yeah.
And the authority is aware of that.
Yeah. Ed, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a quick comment about hunting methods, because I think that's like what it gets to the whole discussion about mist nets, and just kind of thinking about so-called, we were to draw on fisheries management on input controls, I guess. And well, the data that we have from the analysis that we did for hunting, actually has quite good, we could derive a data set basically on hunting methods from that set of articles and references that we use. And that was something that I thought at some point of putting it together, but it's just capacity, I guess, what is limiting here, because we can actually extract the data from all the records on hunting to map where hunting is happening with different methods. And like more or less I kind of had a sense of what's going on. And Southeast Asia is definitely an area where a lot of hunting happens through lots of different methods. And what you were describing about the use of fishing nets as a way to catch birds is definitely happening in Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen people knit nets together if they can't get rope or string or anything to make a net. So people make a net out of whatever they can find if they need to.
But from our shorebirds project, as Batrisyia will also testify, because we go outside to other parts, coastal parts of Sarawak, it's very rarely heard that people use mist nets. If they do, we'll report to the authorities. They are really quite effective. They are all over. Sarawak Forestry Department are in every state in Sarawak. So the enforcement unit would be quite effective. But this case that we heard at the Sarawak, that was reported to us at Sejingka Ashmore, I believe is quite isolated. And also the Chinese company are actually the engineers. I'm not sure if they eat shorebirds, but they are living nearby now that they are working at the site. So it's either the villagers, which is unheard of all these years that we have been monitoring there. We don't know. We'll just have to find out.
Well, hopefully that is something you'll find out during our next tranche of surveying and going out and talking to those people also. Vicky has a question in the chat. Ed, interested to know what level of detail you have in the data set on hunting methods. Is it shooting versus trapping or down to different trapping types so you can ease out nets versus lime sticks, etc.?
Oh, we actually had that. Yeah, again, it's a matter of capacity of actually extracting the data, but it's quite detailed. And like when it comes to shooting, well, of course, I mean, like shooting can come, in so many different ways, but the trapping is definitely provided in higher resolution. So, yeah, clap traps, I think, is one of them.
Yeah.
Noose traps is another one. There are some cases in which they are using shrimps with baited hooks. It's definitely quite, yeah. And again, I don't think the data is systematic, but the data would definitely allow you to map and understand more thoroughly the variation of methods.
Well, I am sure the folks doing the comprehensive review will be interested in your data that's coming down the line then. I just want to be cognizant of everybody's time since we are going to go over a little bit, but are there any other comments that anybody would like to make or questions before we move on and adjourn? Anybody else? Yes, Chris, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I really just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. I was passed on this meeting in my role as a wildlife lead for Asia Pacific for WWF, and I also look at IWT, illegal wildlife trade, across the region. So the greater Mekong countries, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, Mongolia, and some of the Pacific countries. And I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about, how these hunting and the hunting issues, I guess, with migratory species. The reason being is I'm trying to develop a regional program addressing IWT, and part of that is, looking at migratory species across the region. So really great to hear some of the work that's been done, but I would like to, if anyone's interested, to talk more on addressing some of these threats at a site level through problem-oriented approaches and things like this that are used in countering wildlife trade or countering wildlife problems. I'd really be interested to talk some more, and I'll put my email address in the chat. So just say hi to everyone. Thank you.
Sure. I encourage you to check out our program of work for the ITTEA then. There's some good places, and we can
I
always
will.
schedule a meeting to talk more about that if you're interested in that.
Excellent.
It's nice to meet you. Umberto, you have your hand up.
Likewise. Thank you.
Nice to meet you, WWF. We will be very interested to work also on raptors on that. I just posted on the chat a questionnaire on raptor monitoring in Asia that we are running as a Raptor MOU to look really at what are the ongoing situation, what will be the areas and how the different species are covered across the range. So I would invite you all within the Asia mainland, basically, to look at and contribute to this questionnaire. We have time until ideally end of October, 25th in particular, but I mean, will be flexible, of course. Please circulate as widely as possible so that we can get a better overview on that. So that is my call for contribution from this part of the world. It is, as we said, for CMS, a bit of a loose end, let's put it this way. So thank you for your contribution on this analysis.
Great. I will copy that link and be sure to share that again with our follow-up email. And are there any other things that anybody would like to add for? Okay. Well, thank you again, everybody, for coming. I don't think we have any other business unless anybody would like to raise any. But thank you again for coming, like I said. And it is quite late for two of us, so I think we are going to look to wrap this up. Hopefully, I will be able to see all of you in the next meeting of the ITTEA, which will probably be us talking about some consultation with just Sport Board, hopefully. So hopefully you'll be able to attend, your colleagues will be able to attend, or you can always email me or Yvonne or Tillman or Mark or Umberto about anything else that we've talked about today. And yeah, I will put everything on the meeting website after also, just so everybody has access to it. And then this is recorded, so we'll have the link out to everybody also. So thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Nice to see you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah, bye. Nice to
Thank
see
you. Great.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.